going back to the point about nihilism, I think that this vein of philosophy is actually very, very relevant. I was recently reading. I feel like this. There's a book published recently by a guy called Jon Stewart, who's not the American TV host, although I'm sure that his thoughts about nihilism are also potent and stuff. But it's a kind of Jon Stewart did a kind of historical survey of nihilism in the 19th century, and he conceives of nihilism. He conceives of the origins of nihilism as this kind of end of 18th, beginning of 19th century, at least modern nihilism, right? Because you can find a kind of sentiment of nihilism very, very much earlier than that. I mean, there's, it comes up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think is the oldest known work of literature. It might not be. I feel like that's a fact that I need to check, but it's really bloody old. So like Gilgamesh's brother or best friend, I can't remember exactly, dies, and Gilgamesh has this like, existential crisis. Where it's like,
spoilers, everybody.
Oh yes, I'm terribly sorry. It's in like the fourth tablet.
I think it's the text that you've had literally the most amount of possible time to get to grips with.
So, yeah.
Because people often say that it's like if it's a spoiler, they'll be like, well, look, it's been out for 10 years. I mean, this has been out since.
It's been out since.
Yeah, so fair enough. But
so Gilgamesh's brother, stroke best friend, I think, dies, and Gilgamesh just has a complete like existential meltdown. Just says, well, what's the point in carrying on? Because A, I've just lost a loved one, and B, that's going to happen to me at some point, and that's just fundamentally terrifying. And who can blame him? And then you've got a similar sentiment in Ecclesiastes, where was it vanity, all is vanity?
Yes. Interestingly, in Ecclesiastes, which is of course part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, this is sort of this outpouring of nihilistic concern, and the Hebrew word is hevel. Everything is hevel. And it's unclear precisely how to translate it. So in the King James Bible, it's vanity. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. In more modern translations, you tend to find the word meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless.
Yeah, I think that vanity only took on its kind of narcissistic vibes, I suppose, later on. I don't know if it's, at the point of the translation of the King James, but
there's something more poetic about describing the rolling in of the tide and the rolling out of the tide and its endlessness as vanity, but meaningless better captures what we were doing today. I have heard some suggest that since the development of absurdism as a philosophy, that the best translation in the modern age is actually absurd.
That's fantastic.
Everything is absurd.
I mean, I actually think that's very, very cool.
It captures it quite well, right?
Because the Camus translation of the Bible.
What Ecclesiastes writes about, and people should read it. It's one of the shortest.
It's not very long
in the Old Testament. It's one of the shortest, and it begins with this teacher. Meaningless. Says the teacher, everything is meaningless, and then just goes in this outpouring. He says, in that sort of Camusian spirit, people will go to work, they'll come home. The sun will rise, the sun will set, and there's nothing new under the sun. People will, and it's that motif throughout the book, under the sun. People create things, but there's nothing new under the sun. There's that people toil and then they die, and nothing changes under the sun. And the author, who I think is sometimes identified with Solomon.
Yes, I think
is talks about how he was once a great king, and he had riches, and he went through this period where he didn't deny his eyes any pleasures that they saw. He allowed himself to indulge in everything, and he had money, and he had fame, and he had land, but all of it was hevel, that is meaningless. And the fact that he's basically saying, look, I allowed myself to sort of get everything that I desired, but there was still something that was just not doing it for me. This Camusian idea of absurdism, that our desires of how the world should be are constantly rubbing up against the reality of the world, which I think is a good definition of absurdism. Is quite well captured, I think, in this spirit, and so I think maybe absurd is a good good translation of Ecclesiastes.
I suppose in some ways you want kind of absurd, everything absurd, and then a little footnote and saying, in the tradition of French absurd. I think you're right. It captures a very potent nihilistic spirit.
It's an old idea, is what you're saying. Like this thread of meaninglessness and despair. It's ancient. It's not some modern phenomenon.
It's very ancient, and you see it crop up. I mean, arguably, you kind of see it crop up in philosophy philosophers like here and there. Like I'd even argue that you see it a tiny bit in like the beginning of Descartes' second meditation, where he's like,
Really?
I've doubted everything, and now I don't know what to do, and I can't stand this. So what am I going to do about it?
You're so right. Yeah.
You know, and so I do think it's kind of an old problem.
Descartes says I sort of found myself, my feet couldn't find the ground, and yet my head couldn't find the ceiling, and I was sort of floating around in this abyss. And he described like a real despair just at doing his thought experiment of realizing that he doesn't know how to prove anything is true, and it's personal. It's surprisingly personal moment in the meditation.
Yeah, it's about as existential as the kind of uber mathematical logic like Descartes will get, you know. But it's you know, I think it's but I use it to illustrate the idea that actually, you know, as a kind of philosophical emotive structure, nihilism is really, really old. And but as a kind of modern phenomenon, historically, it's often thought to have emerged at the kind of late 18th. I need to get my centuries lined up. Yeah, late 18th, early 19th, with this kind of scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. You know, this idea of, okay, you've got you have a kind of series of promises that have been made culturally at that time. You know, you've got immortality and free will and the existence of God, and like basically this kind of underlying normativity strung through the world at the deepest level. You know, I mean, I think that. Like, you know, in some ways, I think this is really exemplified in Kant, where it's like, you know, you've got God and rationality and ethics are all kind of like meshed together in this big ball of normative stuff. That's, you know, and as I say, you know, Kant's an absolute genius. But and I think that actually one of the hallmarks of his genius is he kind of makes this all work. But I think that you know, I think that I've lost my train of thought. But yes, no, I think that part of the emergence of nihilism is this increase in pure descriptive scientific language. And I mean, you know, in some ways this is you know, it's still something we're dealing with today, right? I think, you know, still the majority of the world is religious, so the majority of the world hasn't gone through this. If you think that people will eventually end up atheist, which I suppose is its own assumption, but it's certainly something we have to deal with because we're both atheists. And
although, you know, sometimes people will say that at least I'm not, or that I don't act like one. I'm constantly getting accused.
This act like thing. I'd love to come back to that.
Yeah, because I really,
pragmatic definitions of belief.
We must talk about whether belief is best exemplified by how you act out, especially in relation to nihilism.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's a reasonably powerful argument that like nobody's a total nihilist, at least not in practice. You know, because I do think that anyway, I'll come back to it later. But so there's this kind of stripping away of various different promises that have been made. So, there was a God, and you know, you're going to be immortal. You're going to be reunited with your loved ones in the next life, and then it's like, oh well, maybe you won't.
And there's a moral author.
Yeah, there's a moral author. There's
an authoritative historical scripture.
Yes, yeah. There's all sorts of
a narrative of your history, the history of your people, and
you know, this is kind of. In a certain sense, this is summed up in Nietzsche's, you know, God is dead and we have killed him, and then you know, this wonderful line of I can't remember exact phrasing, but how should we how can we live with ourselves, the murderers of all murderers?
Yes,
I thought that's a cracking line, partly because of the kind of double pun, right? Because you've killed the highest being, and also at the same time, at least temporarily, abolished the concept of murder. And it's a wonderful statement. I don't know if I'm just reading into that. I don't know if it holds in the German, but like
right.
but you know, but provided that it does, it's really, really cool. And but yeah, so you've got these kind of promises, and the idea of, okay, this gradual expansion of scientific knowledge is sort of eroding these promises. And so this is where I kind of think that, okay, if we're going to have a starting point for a working definition of nihilism that we can use to discuss and then chop and change, and people can add things and remove things, because you know, it's like I said, it's a cluster concept. I don't think we're going to get to like the form of nihilism where I can be like, I have this characteristic function that picks out all of the things that are nihilism and leaves out all of the things that aren't. But I think that the closest thing I can think of is something like a disbelief or devaluing of a thing.
To watch the full conversation, click the link that's on your screen. Subscribe to my main channel or this clip's channel by clicking just below it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.